This is the last of a series of 4 Sunday mornings on the theme of progress. We began with the early idea of a consistent God who designed a good world with potential for improvement, universal improvement. Then we looked at what people usually mean by progress today, typically new technologies and economic growth. Last week we saw how before the First World War, many people thought progress was inevitable, and then after the war, people questioned whether there is such a thing. When God is taken out of the picture, there is no overall plan. The result is that we can't agree about what progress would consist of, and even if we could, we have no reason to suppose it will ever actually happen in the future. So, that was a pretty negative conclusion, and I'm going to try and offer something much more positive today. As we conclude the series, I want to have another look at that religious idea that the universe and our lives are intentionally designed to make progress possible. And this is going to be my way of putting it, and you're quite at liberty to think I'm completely wrong, and that's fine. Right, it goes back to ancient times, the days of the early Jews and Christians at least. The first Christians held a variety of very different beliefs. Some thought the world was badly made by evil gods. The possibility of progress is based on a very different belief that the world was well made by a good God, and that was a major issue of debate in the 2nd century. The best known defender of a good God was a 2nd century bishop called Irenaeus, and I'll come back to him later. After that, Eastern and Western Christianity went separate ways. Most Western Europeans became much more negative about the human condition. They thought of history as distinct ages with sudden jumps. Creation, fall, redemption, second coming of Christ, and in between nothing much changes. So there's very little concept of progress there. All we have is the sudden jumps. Many people still think this is the standard Christian teaching, and it isn't what we normally mean by progress. It doesn't fit our modern concept of history either, so that's another issue. Eastern Christianity retained the progressive idea of thinkers like Irenaeus, who I mentioned. As they saw it, humans are called to become more like God, and they call it deification, which means becoming more like God. Now, if you're used to more negative accounts of Christianity, all about sin and guilt, you may find it surprising that the first Christians didn't have that. At first, Christianity was much more hopeful, more positive, and progressive. So, to make my point, on your handout, the back page, I've given you quotations, mainly from early Christians and some from the Greek Orthodox tradition. So that's just to illustrate the fact that Christianity at first was much more positive. So, this more positive account. It depends on 3 theories which can't be proved or disproved, but make a big difference to how we conceive of our own lives. First, there is an intention behind the universe and our lives. When we think our lives have no meaning, that's when people mostly commit suicide. Most of us, when we think about it, feel that our lives have meaning and value. Our sense of meaning and value tells us our lives have a purpose, which is greater than ourselves. It's not just what we've decided. There's something bigger. We are on the way somewhere, even if we don't know where. We might think of it as a long-term plan. Something like that. Right, the second thing is, the lives we are given are fundamentally good with potential to become even better. If life isn't good in the first place, it's a tragedy. If there's no potential for improvement, this is as good as it gets. When we believe progress is possible, we have hope. One image I sometimes use is, think of the first bike you had. You were probably a little child. It was exciting. It was good to have a bike. But a year later, you look back on that and think, I was useless at riding that bike. I can go much faster now. And that's the way it is. We begin with something good that has potential for improvement. That's what I'm talking about. The third thing is that actual improvement depends on the human use of freedom. If a perfect world would include perfect humans, to be perfect means being willing to sacrifice our own interests for the sake of the common good, when we could have looked after ourselves and ignored the effect on others. And that really is very largely what morality is all about. So, on this account, progress is about becoming holy, becoming more like God. And what makes this possible is our freedom to choose between good and bad. The process is described by evolutionary psychologists, and it goes something like this. As our ancestors evolved from other forms of life, they inherited instincts. Some instincts are to look after ourselves, and some are to help others. They call it selfishness and altruism. Researchers do endless experiments on unfortunate chimpanzees. If you ever fancy becoming another animal, don't try chimpanzee. They'll do experiments on you. Right. At one stage, our animal ancestors didn't think about what they were doing, but just did it instinctively. And that's true of most animals. They would do some self-centered things to protect themselves and produce children, but would also do some what they call altruistic things to help others. Researchers do endless experiments, and so this is what they come to. And then the next stage is that after you've got this pattern of usually looking after yourself, but sometimes helping others, our distant ancestors learnt to attribute choices to other individuals. To take an example, suppose after the service I bump into you and spill coffee all down your new dress. Now, from your point of view, it's useful if you can work out whether I did it deliberately. In the same way, researchers watch what happens when one chimpanzee hurts another. Does the victim blame the aggressor? Does the victim think the aggressor did it deliberately? And it's useful to the victim to be able to judge. Right? So, our distant ancestors attributed free choices to others. The next stage is to attribute free choices to yourself. Most of us still find it easier to pass judgment on other people's actions than on our own. Well, when we have learnt the idea that we ourselves have choices, we can then think about what we are about to do and ask ourselves, do I have to do this? Could I do something else instead? And this is when freedom becomes possible. We stop being links in a fixed chain of cause and effect. And instead we become able to choose between alternatives. So, first we got our instincts, and later on we got the ability to override them by thinking about the best thing to do. But we still have our instincts, we still have our wants. What makes our freedom morally significant is that what we want for ourselves often conflicts with the common good, with what other people need. When we are threatened, we usually look after our own interests. When we are successful and confident, it becomes easier to care about what other people need. The task facing us is to care about the common good enough to put it before self-interest. As we practice the art of caring for the common good, we may find ourselves able to make big sacrifices for the sake of others. So, in this account, we are all somewhere on the way in a long historical process, neither at the beginning nor at the end. At the beginning was the creation of the universe, the Big Bang or whatever that was. At the end, who knows? But we're talking about it in terms of becoming like God, deification, becoming holy somehow. And we're somewhere in the process, somewhere in the middle. And as we become more like God, that's progress. What can we do about it? Well, every faith tradition offers methods for reflecting on our own lifestyles, our own behavior, asking ourselves whether we can do better. This is the stuff, you all know about this. This is the stuff of praying, meditating, contemplation, self-examination, confession. Behind all those processes is this sense of us becoming what God calls us to be. We know at first hand what we want, and we can usually extrapolate to what the people around us probably want. When we take time to think about how we affect other people and the world around us, we can ask ourselves whether we are wanting the right things. When and how our rational thought should override our self-centered instincts, whether our way of life could become more godly. And when we make changes of that sort, whether through prayer or in whatever way, that's progress. Well, there you are. I'm going to just finish with one of those quotations from Irenaeus, because he described it as well as anyone. And he was writing before the sort of the guilt-ridden stuff really became popular. Right. If thou then, this is a second quotation on your back page. If then thou art God's workmanship, await the hand of thy Maker, which creates everything in due time. In due time, as far as thou art concerned, whose creation is being carried out. Offer to him thy heart in a soft and tractable state, and preserve the form in which the Creator has fashioned thee, having moisture in thyself, lest by becoming hardened thou lose the impressions of his finger. But by preserving the framework, thou shalt ascend to that which is perfect, for the moist clay which is in thee is hidden there by the workmanship of God. He will cover thee over, within and without, with pure gold and silver.